My name is Tanya Beckett. I'm a business and news presenter at the BBC, and this is Niall Ferguson, who, as many of you will know, is the author of many books. The one I think that I remember most, of course, because I do business news, is The Ascent of Money. So, Niall, let me start off with what immediately is on the table is more Europe. What do we mean by more Europe?
The vision of more Europe, in fact, means a more German Europe, a Europe that's constitutionally more like the Federal Republic. And my view is that that's fine. In fact, it's logically necessary. Having created a monetary union, now more than a dozen years ago, the Europeans within that monetary union need to take the next step to a fully functional federal fiscal system. And the absence of fiscal federalism is the core reason for the instability that we've seen over the last 2 years. It's a really quite simple and historical point. You cannot have a monetary union without some kind of fiscal federalism. No attempt to do this has ever succeeded.
You've talked about creating, it's almost like a larger Germany in some ways, but bringing together the likes of Greece, Italy and France surely would be a very different thing than the bringing together of Germany when it happened, or not?
Well, of course, and I don't want to express this in an inflammatory way. The point is a purely technical one. The institutional shift that is envisaged by the phrase more Europe is simply an institutional shift from a confederal structure, which is what the European Union currently has. There's almost no central fiscal power, that very little money flows from the nation states to the European institutions. It's invisibly small. In fact, it's been declining in relative terms. From that system to a federal system means a transition to something more like the Federal Republic of Germany. And there are other federations one could talk about too. It's not just the Germans who have federalism, it's also, for example, the Americans. The question, which I think you're right to ask, is whether or not it's possible for Europe's diverse peoples to live in a federal political system. I think it is.
Okay, but when the Eurozone was put together, I think it was probably understood that spending and taxes are a very highly politicised issue. So therefore it would be difficult to suddenly create some sort of fiscal union in the way that you're describing. Also, that the Germans didn't particularly fancy financing the Greeks if the Greeks ran out of money, and that's been very clear in the last couple of years. So when Germany was put together, when Switzerland was put together, when the US was put together, was tax and spend such a highly politicised issue? Was it just easier to bolt it together because people didn't think it was politics then? Do you see what I'm saying?
Absolutely. In some ways, the stakes were lower because governments took a smaller share of national income in the 18th or 19th centuries. So the problem today is that when governments actually account for, in some European cases, more than 50% of GDP, it's a bigger issue. But if you go back and look at the debates that went on, say, over the creation of the United States, the drawing up of the Constitution, or the debates about the Constitution of the German Reich, they were very, very difficult, problematic, and heated arguments. The question of how you allocate resources from the periphery to the centre, and crucially, how resources get redistributed within a federation is always a really hot button issue. The core way in which federations work is that the more productive parts of the federation, whether they're called states or Länder, end up transferring resources to the less productive parts of the federation. That's how it works. But it's never easy. There are always people grumbling, always saying, oh, why should we pay for these lazy southerners? That argument is as old as the idea of federalism itself.
But there are also two other lessons that Germany has learned recently, or more recent history. One of them is the risk of inflation and what impact that has on a society, and that's been a really big argument in how much money the European Central Bank should print. And the other one is that it had to absorb East Germany. I mean, essentially that's what happened. And that was bad enough, that was difficult enough. And they were Germans, you know, they were members of the same family in many cases who'd been separated. So is it too much to ask that Germany should, you know, take a strong intake of breath and do this again?
Well, maybe, and that's why the question has to be posed explicitly. There's no point any longer pretending that this isn't the project. More Europe has to mean something concrete. It has to mean, yeah, German taxpayers are going to be transferring resources every year to Greek taxpayers. That's how it's going to work. And unless you put the question clearly, we will just carry on with this so-called muddle-through policy, which is actually a recipe for disaster. I want to make that very, very clear. Dithering around, procrastination, muddling through has, if you follow the story back to the financial crisis's origins in 2007, made the European problem progressively worse. They procrastinated deliberately in the mistaken belief that if they gave the banks time, it would all be okay. And I said then this was a mistake, that the problem of European banks was bigger than the problem of American banks, and the sooner that was recognised, the better, including, by the way, the German banks. So it's really important to get clarity and come to a decision. And I want to argue today that the decision is very, very clear. Either you go to a federal system, not an austerity pact, that's not enough. There has to be a transfer union, to use another German term, and there have to be Eurobonds. In other words, there have to be bonds issued by this federation, this European federation, with the full faith and credit of all the governments, including the German government. Without that, the European Monetary Union is a chronically unstable system, which will ultimately cause another shock to the world economy comparable with the one that the US crisis of 08-09 caused. If the answer to the question is no, we don't want that, which of course Britain has already said, but if the German answer to the question is actually no, we don't want that, then the monetary union has to be dismantled.
With your understanding of history, if you were trying to talk to a German and say, look, it's a really good idea for you to pay tax and give it to the Greeks, how would you phrase that in such a way that may be a little bit more attractive to the average German?
Well, first of all, this is not my problem.
Thankfully.
This is not my problem, because I told the Germans and anybody else who cared to listen that this was a major problem back in 1999-2000 when this whole thing was started. But if I were in the situation of having to sell the idea to German voters, I'd say this, look, if you go down the route of dismantling the monetary union, if you take my option B, you will find yourself with something called the Deutschmark again. Now, some of you may feel quite happy about that, but remember, it's been tremendously to Germany's advantage over the last 12 years to have a relatively weak currency.
Yes.
If you had still had the Deutschmark through that time, do you really think your exports to China would have grown the way they have?
Okay.
So that would be point number one. Point number two is, look, guys, this is not going to be cheap. The transfers from Germany to the periphery are way bigger than anybody wants to say. It's probably around, deep breath, 8% of gross domestic product from Germany to the periphery every year for the indefinite future. So
I'm going outside for a cigarette after this.
You know, let's be absolutely clear. This is a hard sell.
Okay, let's talk about Greece. If you're sitting in Greece, that's a really, really painful place to be right now.
Yeah,
Unemployment
they're in a
rising very
depression.
quickly.
They are in a depression.
Yeah, and the social impact of that is huge. These are not just numbers, these are people, of course. So why, if you are Greek, and there seems to be very strong Greek commitment to staying within the euro, but why?
Well, one of the most surprising things about Europe today is how little anti-European sentiment there is, even in those countries that are being punished with austerity budgets imposed essentially from outside. You would expect by now there to be at least some politicians in countries like Greece, or for that matter Portugal, which remember is next in line, because whatever happens to Greece will happen next to Portugal. You would expect there to be many politicians running around saying, the hell with this. Let's be Latin American about this. Let's just default. Go back to our own currencies. It's not happening. It's not happening because people remember how much worse off they were in the old days when they had their own currencies, and the solution to the problem was always devaluation. Devaluation and inflation. That was how we used to adjust these imbalances within Europe. And nobody really wants to go back to those old currencies in Southern Europe. nor, and this is a really crucial point, nor does anybody in Southern Europe feel the kind of visceral antagonism to the idea of a European federation that the British do. The British are almost the only people who really hate this idea. And it's interesting that enthusiasm for Europe is inversely correlated with enthusiasm for national institutions. The Italians know that their own national political institutions are terrible. That's why they like Europe. So there's no great anti-European movement, except little flickers of it in the virtuous north, the true Finns. So what's interesting is that everybody is locked into more Europe. There isn't a massive anti-European campaign anywhere. But they won't admit to themselves what more Europe really means, which, as I've been trying to say, means a transfer union, a federal Europe, the Federal Republic of Europe, with the transfers that that implies from the core to the periphery.
Why do we not feel the same in the UK?
That's a long story.
Well, just give me a short version.
I think the reason that Britain is in this position is that we have collectively a great deal of justified scepticism about whether such a federal system can work. And we, I think quite rightly, have questioned the viability of the Federal Republic of Europe, and we've certainly legitimately questioned whether we can be part of it. I don't think, in other words, this is just some atavistic desire to replay old war movies. I think this is based on a perfectly well-reasoned critique of the project. But what they have to see, what everybody has to see, is that if you're not prepared to do it, if you're not prepared to have that transfer union, then you must dismantle the monetary union and accept that the high tide of European integration was roughly around the Treaty of Maastricht, and it's now receding. It's over. The project went as far as it could, and we know its limits. So.
We started off with endless, red tape from Brussels, and I don't know what the point of that was. Maybe it was to create a level playing field or philosophy within the EU about how its citizens were going to live. What philosophy are we going to end up with what it means to be a European? That's a difficult question to answer, I know, at the end, but I wonder if the philosophy actually of what this is about has changed, particularly with words this week along the lines of Europe is not competitive and we need to start being competitive.
Regardless of whether the European Union becomes a federation or reverts to being a confederation with multiple currencies, the issue of competitiveness remains. The fragmentation of Europe, and in particular the divergence in productivity that one sees in the European labour market, is really a problem when you put Europe in a global context, which we really haven't in this discussion until now. Europe's biggest problem is not so much the imbalances between Germany and Greece. Europe's biggest problem is the imbalance between Europe and the rest of the world in a whole range of dimensions, not only in terms of the way in which Europeans work, the real problem of unit labour costs, but also in terms of the way our institutions work, the way our educational system works. There are so many different ways in which Europe is falling behind the rest of the world that in some ways future historians are going to say, that whole argument about a single currency was kind of beside the point. That wasn't their biggest problem. Why did they waste so much time on it?
Niall, thank you very much indeed. We're very grateful for your time.
Thanks, Tanya.